And if you do need live captions, absolutely. We would like you to introduce yourselves in the chat just for Rohit's purpose. That would be really great. And you know, we love to see your faces, but that's always optional as well. And we always like to start our meetings with a land acknowledgement. So Sean, did you want to go ahead with that? Thank you.
Sure. We'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we work, that we know as Peel or all of Ontario for the benefit of everyone here, is part of the treaty lands and territories in Mississaugas of the Credit. For thousands of years, Indigenous peoples inhabited and cared for this land. In particular, we acknowledge the territory of the Anishinaabe, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Ojibwe Chippewa peoples, the land that is home to the Métis, and most recently, the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, who are direct descendants of the Mississaugas of the Credit. We're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land, and by doing so, give our deepest respect to its first inhabitants. For those of you joining from outside Peel, encourage you to visit native-land.ca to get a better idea of the territory that we're on. And if you want to learn about the Mississaugas of the Credit, visit their website at mncfn.ca. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. So today we're going to speak about the OTF Resiliency Fund, and we have invited Rohit Mehta from DoGood Fundraising to really walk us through. And this is he has prepared a presentation that is very specifically focused on volunteer centers across Ontario and how you can potentially apply, whether you've been successful in the first round or not, but how you can apply in this round. And Rohit comes with quite a bit of experience. He's very, very familiar with volunteer management. Actually, when he was in his early days, before he even went into university as a high school student, he started volunteering Peel. And then went on through university and came back and decided to establish his firm as grant writing and fundraising and fund development in general. So I'm going to, without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Rohit. And grant writing is his expertise, and he has other people on his team as well. So we're really, really thrilled to have Rohit here. And thank you so much, Rohit, for doing this for us.
Thank you, Corinne, and good morning, everyone. So just really briefly, I'm just going to start by telling you a little bit about myself and then jump right into the grant here. So I graduated from the University of Toronto, Mississauga. I've been involved in the sector for a number of years, as well as having been a grant review team member with the Ontario Trillium Foundation. So I spent 5 years doing that, learned a little bit of the ins and outs of how that work goes from a funder's perspective, as a juror, as somebody who's making decisions on the grants. So I started this company, DoGood Fundraising, to share some of what I've learned. I feel like they're almost secrets that are held deep within the realm of funders. And I firmly believe that we need to share this with volunteer centers. We need to share this with nonprofits if we want to build capacity and grow the sector. So DoGood Fundraising itself is not affiliated with Ontario Trillium Foundation or the province of Ontario. This information is being provided free of charge to volunteer centers through Volunteer MBC. And we're happy to be sharing this with you to hopefully help you learn more about the grant and ideally apply for the grant. Now, we offer a few services: all-inclusive grant writing, that's where we write your grants from start to finish; prospect research, that's where we find grants; professional development training like this or in person; and monthly consultations. Please ask us about our annual plan. So in today's presentation, we'll talk about
Rohit, sorry, if you want to just bring up your slides.
Yeah.
They're not appearing for us yet.
You're not seeing my swap presenter slideshow. I wonder. Okay, I'll start from the Can you see that?
Yes.
We'll start with a grant overview and talk about the eligibility for the grant. I'll discuss some different eligible projects, particularly for volunteer centers, and which expenses you can apply for. We'll talk about some tips for how to develop an effective proposal, and then we'll have a chance to ask questions and specific questions about your work, your center, and hopefully everybody on the webinar can benefit from that conversation. That's why we're doing this as a team here. And feel free to use the chat throughout the meeting. The Volunteer MBC team will be monitoring that. So let's get into the grant itself. The Resilient Communities Fund is an Ontario Trillium Foundation grant, which really aims to support recovery within our sector. It was meant to help manage the emerging needs as a result of COVID so that we can effectively meet needs across all of Ontario's communities. And the idea is that community-based projects and activities will be supported through the fund, but it's specifically meant to rebuild the capacity. So it's not operating funding, it's not core funding, it's truly capacity building funding for nonprofits that have been affected by COVID-19. And I really want to emphasize this point. The grant is for organizations that have been affected by COVID. In the narrative, in the all the text that you provide in the grant and the whole idea behind the grant is that you have to describe how your organization was impacted and how you're going to adapt from those impacts, or how you're going to be resilient after those impacts. That's why it's called the Resilient Communities Fund. Now, the grant itself is due on December 8th at 5 p.m. It's through the Ontario Trillium Foundation portal, which is an online system. If you haven't used it before, I do recommend that you create a login early. And the funding is from $5,000 to $150,000 for up to 1 year. So up to 1 year means if you apply on or before December 8th, we're probably anticipating the funds to arrive in late March, maybe early April, based on the past track record of Trillium throughout COVID. And so you can and should plan for a start date after March of next year for any project that you're planning to take on. I should also note that this is round 3, which means anybody who applied in round 1 and round 2, if those organizations were declined, they're probably going to be applying again. Of course, organizations that didn't hear about the grant or weren't able to apply are also going to be applying. So this may be the most competitive round. That being said, I highly encourage you to apply. We won't see a grant like this again, as most of the restrictions are lifting, and we anticipate the Ontario Trillium Foundation will go back to its regular seed grow capital funding beginning next year. So who's eligible? Probably most of the organizations on this call. Community-based or provincial nonprofits or charities are eligible. There are specific requirements when it comes to financials, which we can talk about a bit later on. But the main goal or the primary purpose is organizations that are delivering community-based programs and services to Ontario residents. Of course, it's an Ontario-focused organization, which is actually funded by taxpayers if you follow the funding chain. And so that's the goal. All the work should really be taking place within Ontario. Now, if your organization has experienced disruptions to your programs, to your operations, to your services due to COVID, this is for you, and this is the key eligibility requirement, as I mentioned. The other thing is you have to show a minimum of 12 months of financial history in your financial statements. So they have quite rigorous financial requirements, which includes an audit at certain levels of finances. And you also might not find this online, but you have to have at least $12,500 showing on your books in order to even be eligible for their funding. Eligible projects and expenses. Let's talk about the 5 main outcomes that the Ontario Trillium Foundation is focused on in this fund. Now, we've taken these outcomes and we've summarized them into a diagram to make it easy to explain. So these are the 5 main outcomes, what you see on the screen. And we'll go through each of them in detail because there is quite a bit of detail. And I'm pretty excited to share that within these outcomes, you can do almost anything. I mean, any challenge you guys have had due to COVID, any impacts that your organization has faced, any gaps, I think that volunteer centers can truly take advantage of this funding and find a way to pivot and to recover and to really build resiliency as a result of this new funding. So let's start talking about number one, which is to equip board members and employees with supports. So in outcome number one, it's really meant to support new approaches, to prepare for change, to build resiliency within the organization. And what you can do, there's quite a bit. So you can take on training and coaching for your staff, for your board members. You can implement strategic planning. So let's say your organization was headed on a certain trajectory. You used to do in-person trainings with volunteer managers. You used to offer specialized services, and now everything has changed due to COVID. You can bring in a professional and not a sort of bottom tier professional. You can actually pay somebody a great amount of money to conduct a very thorough and comprehensive strategic planning exercise for your center. This outcome also funds implementation, research, and development. So consider that your organization wants to go in a bit of a different direction, and you want to determine, would this new direction work for us? Is it something that would help us to stay open and keep our doors open and to maybe generate new revenue for our services? You can actually have someone come in and do research, or you can have them implement research that somebody else has paid for. There's so many ways that you can leverage the funding as a volunteer center to build capacity. And the list goes on. You can even purchase health and well-being supports for your staff. Maybe this is how you're going to retain employees following the impacts of the pandemic. They'll actually pay for those supports, such as benefits for your team. So the second one we're going to look at is improve financial resources and alternative revenue streams. So in this one, it's really about developing new and alternative sources of revenue. And I love this one, of course, as a fundraising professional, because you can hire us to do work in this section. You can also hire other fundraising professionals. So fundraising plans is something that can be developed through this particular outcome. You can identify fundraising and financial technology resources. So within our sector, Razor's Edge is one of the go-to for most organizations that have donors and want to categorize them within a system and keep track of them as they move through that cycle. You can actually identify that as a potential solution in order to improve your revenue. And you can also identify other technology. Maybe it's a new system that you need to process all the incoming revenue because you've started doing online training. Maybe it's another type of technology altogether that I haven't mentioned. These are the ways that different volunteer centers across Ontario can leverage this outcome to bring in new money or to have the capacity to bring in money, the tools, the systems, the resources. Now, interestingly enough, the funder has said you can also seek resources for public-private partnerships and social finance. We know that the provincial or federal government has announced an $800 million social finance fund. That's old news. Now that they've been re-elected, they're probably going to be committed to that fund. The Investment Readiness Program, which actually funds social finance, should have opened in October. It didn't. We don't know why. But right here within the text, it does say that you can explore social finance and seek opportunities for that. And so anything you want to do as a volunteer center to generate revenue, anything you want to sell, any services, any products, let's say you have a new platform that you've developed that you'd like to share with your members. Let's say you have a new consultation service that is specifically for volunteer managers. Maybe you're helping them one-on-one, providing coaching, guidance. With Volunteer MBC, they have a learning center that generates revenue. So whatever you want to do, it probably fits into outcome number two. And as long as it improves and increases your ability to access financial resources and to generate revenue streams, it's an excellent fit here. So try and think big and broad within these outcomes, because you can probably fund almost anything as long as you indicate that it's a result of COVID and it's meant to help you pivot and recover and to be resilient. Let's look at outcome number 3, which is adapt programs and service delivery to meet community needs. In this outcome, we're looking at how you deliver your programs and services to meet the needs of your community at large, your employees, your volunteers. So first and foremost, identifying health and safety processes. Let's say volunteer managers in your community need to be trained on how to do volunteer management within the new health and safety protocols. Maybe you want to provide a little bit of programming as a center to help your volunteer managers in your community to adapt to these challenges. You can obtain funding for that. Technology supports. So an example might be that you're delivering programming as a center, but that programming used to be in person. And now you want to continue to deliver it online or through a hybrid model, just in case there's people who cannot attend future activities in person, right? Because we are talking about March and April of next year onwards. We don't anticipate that you're going to have to do everything online. So in that case, technology supports would certainly be welcome. Maybe you want a really high-powered camera within your boardroom to be able to broadcast. Maybe you have no means to broadcast. You don't have access to Zoom. You don't have access to a good computer, a good camera. You can actually purchase all of those things for the life of the grant. And it is about a 12-month, 6 or 12-month grant. And so you'll want to think about that as you think about what type of supports you want. Now, the other one is staffing and volunteer training and recruitment. So here, you can get help to not pay your core staff, but to pay staff who are going to deliver new programs and services or reimagined programs and services of your center. And this is interesting because you might have had to let go of someone, or maybe there's an opportunity for you to bring on new help if only you had money. Well, this is that opportunity to maybe bring back a staff person to work on a particular program or to bring in somebody new to work on a program. Volunteer training is huge. Maybe your center has a team that goes out there and works with the community, but those folks need training themselves. You can do that through this grant. Recruitment is a big one. Many organizations rely on volunteers and they're struggling because some of their volunteers were older adults who didn't feel comfortable coming out due to COVID restrictions. Well, now you can actually get some money to recruit new volunteers, maybe to hire a volunteer management professional to get out into the community and to do that recruitment. But I think all the centers on this call would find this valuable, but so would your individual members across the province. Let's talk about outcome number 4, which is to procure equipment or renovate spaces according to the new reality. So COVID has placed some challenging restrictions on how we do business. And in this grant, what you can do through outcome number 4 is to meet the changing needs of your organization, its programs and services, and to truly adapt how you work to the new reality. So this means equipment or renovations to meet the needs that have changed. Let's say you work in a space that's very confined, and once in a while you have somebody who comes in and does a volunteer management consultation with your staff. Maybe you want to purchase a really high quality HEPA air filter within that facility. Or maybe it's equipment. Perhaps you need equipment that's going to enable you to operate differently within your center. They also want you to consider health and safety and how you deliver your services. Some organizations work with more vulnerable members of the community. Do you need a plexiglass barrier put up at a desk or at a community station? Do you need a screening station put up? Might be a little late in the pandemic for this, but certainly when this was created, these outcomes were a lot more relevant because organizations truly needed physical barriers. They needed to maintain social distancing. Things are changing a little bit, but your organization might have unique needs that can fall into this. So renovate spaces is an interesting one. You can't truly redo a space. You can't tear down all the walls and build a new office, a new center. But if you made a good case, let's say for instance you need to tear down a wall to make the space bigger in order to allow for social distancing. or in order to deliver your programming, which previously, you could squeeze 12 people into that small room, but now you can't. That may be allowed. So generally, when we're checking what's allowed, we do tend to reach out to the funder if we're unsure. Depending on what the costs are, it may be allowed. If it's simply we're going to take down one wall and it's quite a reasonable cost, certainly it's allowable. If it's we're going to make our washer more accessible and specifically make it touchless, for instance, right? So that anybody from the community who's using it doesn't have to press the tap and press the air dryer and that sort of thing. These are things that would be a good adaptation to COVID and to make your volunteer center really well adapted to the new ways of working. Of the 5 outcomes, I'm just going to read the 5th one here, which is new collaborations to meet community needs. And this is a really good one for volunteer centers because it's about working together with community groups to meet the needs. So take peer learning, for instance. A number of years ago, Volunteer MBC joined a group of organizations and worked with a fundraising consultant to obtain training on fund development. Everybody got access to some prospect research software. All the organizations came together and learned together. And I think they all grew in their capacity. This is the kind of thing that you could do in your community with your members. Now, as the volunteer centers, you might offer some training or you might offer some services. You can actually have organizations apply to this grant to have your services built right into their budgets. Alternatively, you can offer professional development training in the context of COVID, something like how volunteer managers can interact in the new COVID reality, right? And you can offer that professional development training for free, and you can get a grant from this outcome in order to do that. Networking is huge. It's almost died for the last year and a half. And so most of our volunteer centers rely on the ability to bring members together and to create some collaboratives right then and there at the workshops, at the sessions. We really want to encourage our members to work with each other so that we can strengthen volunteer management and strengthen the work of the sector. So anything you do that is networking, as long as it relates to COVID and as long as you're doing it to meet the needs of your communities, within all the challenges we've had, you can certainly get money for that. It's up to you what that looks like, and you can really be creative here. But as you can see, creating and adapting new approaches for collaboration is a big part of outcome number 5. There's also resource sharing, knowledge sharing, and data sharing. So volunteer centers are uniquely positioned with significant data about volunteers, what their interests are, what they like to do, how they work well. You might be well positioned to actually survey all the volunteers in your community to understand how things have changed as a result of COVID and what needs to happen, not just from your own organization's standpoint, but from the whole sector standpoint. And we're always short on data, I find, as nonprofit organizations. We need data to make decisions. And so I do encourage you to think about taking advantage of this outcome to maybe share some data that you might already have, or maybe to take on an exercise of collecting and disseminating data in order to help organizations to really adapt to the impacts of COVID and to have the knowledge they need in order to do that. I'll just check in with the team if there's any questions before we move on here to expenses.
Rohit, I just wanted to ask under 5 specifically, when it's networking, for instance, I did understand that it has to be specifically so that ultimately your volunteer center in this case benefits, right? It can't just be that you're taking this on behalf of another network. It has to be so that ultimately it's going to benefit your volunteer center, correct?
That's correct. And in this outcome, so you're absolutely right, they don't really support networks that much. But what they're saying is that your organization would either create or adopt new approaches for working together to meet the needs of your community. You would lead that effort, right? So your organization would most certainly benefit from being able to convene and bring people together. But the goal at the end is through that networking, you've helped your own organization to pivot or recover or to be resilient from the impacts of COVID. So not networking for the sake of networking, but more so that your organization can maybe take on new directions, bring on new partnerships and opportunities. And it's really about how we word this, right? Because you need to word it as COVID has taken away these opportunities. Now we need networking in order to continue, in order to keep our doors open, in order to meet the needs of our community, which have changed so much as a result of COVID. It's all about COVID in this grant.
Thanks, that's great.
So let's talk about eligible expenses then. Now, there's a number of expenses that are allowed in this grant, which is great. And everything has to be included in the financial workbook, which is really the budget. And so the two categories you're going to see are direct personnel costs, salaries, mercs, benefits, and direct non-personnel costs, which is essentially everything else. And so under direct personnel costs, yes, you can put wages, not for your core staff, but for staff specifically carrying out this project. It's a little bit odd if you have staff right now and you're asking them to work on this project. What we say within these grants is you can apply for the supplemental cost or the incremental cost of those staff working on this specific project. But generally, this funder doesn't want to actually pay your core salaries. It's really short-sighted thinking, but ideally, they actually want you to hire someone for that short term and then end that contract to match the term of this grant. Now, when it comes to non-personnel costs, you can do purchase services. That includes any vendor that's coming in or providing a service to really help you meet the objective of this grant. So consultants are huge, and most applicants will actually be having consultants be procured as part of this grant. Contractors, as I just mentioned, they work for a short term, they have a start date, they have an end date. Does the funder really care if one of those contractors worked with you guys in the past? No. After the life of the grant, could that contractor work with you guys? Sure. But for the life of this grant, they're going to make sure that you actually paid that contractor at least what you said in the grant application, and you're going to have to prove that in your reporting. Also, subject matter experts related to the delivery of the project. So anyone you're bringing in, speakers, consultants, professionals, these all fall under purchase services. Then we have workshops, meetings, and convenings. So here, it's really meetings and convening for the purposes of this grant. Think back to outcome number 5 that we spoke about. You're bringing people together for peer learning. How do you deliver volunteer management? How do you share best practices within the new restrictions of COVID, right? Maybe you're bringing together other volunteer centers within your larger region to all work together and say, okay, folks, we need to really adapt and pivot now because it's not business as usual. And so paying for those room rental costs, the setup costs, even the refreshments related to those events, those can all be covered as convening costs. Even the travel that staff have to do to get to and from those events, to set things up, you have to rent speakers, a mobile screen, that sort of thing. It's all covered under meetings, workshops, meetings, and convening. The list goes on. So supplies and materials. These are items specifically purchased for use in the delivery of the project. Think signage, think workshop supplies, that sort of thing. Capital costs. So this is not to put up a building. Of course, this is more small capital equipment related to the implementation of your project. There's these really great cameras. They cost over $1,000. They're very high power, HD quality. You can live stream your meetings, your workshops, your events. That might fall under there. It could also fall under equipment. So in the next point there, repairs, renovations, equipment specifically for use in project delivery. So I talked about repairs being something like maybe a minor modification to a space, some modifications to make things touchless, that sort of thing. you might need to purchase a computer or a laptop as part of this grant. Those would fall under non-personnel costs as well. So it is quite broad. The list even goes on. Travel is covered. I don't know how much travel you're going to be doing beyond your city or town, but generally any travel costs incurred by employees, volunteers, and participants for the project specifically can be covered. Evaluation is another one. So OTF really encourages evaluation, and I'm huge on this one. You can apply for up to 10% of your total budget. It's say you're asking for $50,000, you can ask for up to $5,000 for evaluation. And this is important because evaluating the project and the outcomes of your project means that next time a grant comes around, you can hand the evaluation report to a funder and say, look, this is what we were able to accomplish. As part of the evaluation, it said we should do a phase 2. It said we should take this a step further. And then the funder will see that and say, okay, this makes sense. Let's fund your step 2, right? And overhead and administration, awesome to see that they'll cover up to 15% of those costs, because of course those costs are very real and you can use those funds as you'd like. The only caveat is you have to tell the Trillium Foundation now. So before, when I used to do grant review, it was just a check mark. Sure, 15%, check. Now things have changed and they want you to tell them exactly how you're going to use those funds. You're applying for the grant, specifically within the budget section, you have to put a note there and say, well, here's how we're going to use our 15%. So I get asked a lot about quotes. Do we have to provide quotes? And in recent years, they changed their restrictions or requirements on requesting a quote. You now have to ask them for any valued items over $10,000. That's a lot of money. So really anything up to $9,999, you don't need a quote, which is, I would say that if you're going for anything 10,000 and up, definitely get 2 quotes. You don't need to upload them, but they could ask for them, and they generally do as part of their due diligence process. They give you about 24 to 48 hours to respond, so you really want to get that done up front. But any items under $10,000, should you get a quote? Yes. I think it's a good idea to always get a quote. Part of the reason is because things change. Today you're applying for a grant. You might be spending that money in April or May of next year. You want to have that well documented, that you asked somebody for a quote and you told them price it for April of next year. If you need to raise the rates, raise the rates. And at that point, I think you will be protected, in terms of how, in terms of ensuring that the money that you've been promised in that quote is actually honored and that you don't have to pay, $1,000 or $2,000 more. The other thing is the budget is very specific. And so in that budget, you can't just write, renovation, $10,000, right? You need to provide some specific details. How did you guys come up with that? And so the funder is looking for those line items, right? You can't get a quote where it just says bathroom renovation, $15,000. That's not sufficient. It needs to be itemized to say, how did they come up with that 15? But even for less than $10,000, you still want to have a general idea of how did they come up with that quote. You'll need to write that in the narrative, right? That we're going to spend this much money. Here's how we came up with it. We've seen lots of vendors group services together, but you want to be as specific as possible. That's how you win this grant. You're also required to do this when you're requesting services. So that includes consulting. You're having a consultant come in. They should at least have a breakdown of how did they come up with that. We always provide that when we're asked for a quote. So I encourage you to do so as well. And so with 2 competitive quotes, it might be an obvious point, but you have to go with the lesser quote. So if you have 2 items, one is valued at $14,000 and one is $15,000. Doesn't matter if the $15,000 one is better. You have to go with the $14,000 quotation. Now there are ineligible costs. So there are costs that you absolutely cannot ask for. Core funding, of course, for any current operations, cannot ask. Any activities that have already taken place in the past, costs that you've already incurred, this is known as retroactive funding. You certainly can't ask for that. And generally, applicants are only eligible for 1 grant per organization. People have asked me, well, what happens if we have an active grant that's currently going on that ends this year? fine, you can still apply as long as the project you're applying for is completely different. I would say go with a different outcome as well. You don't want to be applying for the same sort of thing. If you applied for a grant in the past and you were declined, hopefully you got on a call with the funder and found out why. You should certainly apply again. Now, we provide fund development services and consulting. We can help you to learn how to generate revenue. We can help you with grant writing services, fundraising support. So please reach out to Volunteer NBC if that's something that's of interest to you. Previously, we have committed to writing a number of grants at a fixed rate. And I think this can be really useful because it's essentially allowing you to generate new sources of revenue and you wouldn't have to pay anything. So please do ask about that if needed. I'll take a pause here for a minute in case there's questions, and then we can talk about eligibility requirements.
Rohit, I wanted to ask a little bit more because I know some of the centers, grant writing is perhaps not their expertise. And so even putting an application together in this case, which it is pretty comprehensive, but I don't want volunteer centers, to shy away from that. So how would the pricing work for them? Just to give them an idea of what the cost would be up. Is there any cost up front? What can we do to kind of help them along if funding is an issue, and it's also a volunteer center that is very limited on grant writing capacity?
Yes, I would say generally our rates are about $65 an hour for grant writing. And so we are meticulous about tracking our hours and billing for that. We do offer a rate structure where we actually reduce the rate up front. And organizations have asked us tons of times to set this up. And so we finally did, where we'll take a small percentage fee, like a success fee upon success. And that's only payable upon success. It's about 2.5%. So what we'll do is, I'll say, let's see how many organizations are interested in moving forward on the grant, and certainly do reach out to Volunteer NBC if you are, and we could probably come up with something custom for the volunteer centers who've expressed an interest through this call. And our goal is to help you to build capacity, and so if we can do that and provide you with better rates, and we're happy to do that.
Okay, thank you, Rohit. And I think there's a question in the chat. I believe it's from Heather. And I believe it said something that can you respond to two outcomes?
Yeah, definitely. I would say it's a good idea to respond to 1 to 2. I wouldn't go above 2. And we've been on calls with funders for successes. Of course, we've won the grant. We've been on decline calls. We've been on calls where we didn't even write the grant, and we just offered to join the call. And one thing I did hear in the early days was people were asking for way too much, right? So I've seen this all the time as an OTF grant reviewer. People are choosing multiple. They used to have this strategy. It had all these different columns: green people, active people, this, that, and people would try and they would want to choose multiple, but really with OTF outcomes, you generally want to choose one. And in this grant, you could choose 2. They should be connected in some way. So for instance, let's see here. So for instance, let's say your organization was delivering trainings in person to your member organizations, but now you need to deliver them online, and you want to come up with a new model to improve your financial revenue streams. So outcomes 2 and 3, you would essentially be adapting your programs and service delivery to meet community needs. And so you would switch to an online model. Maybe you would purchase access to Zoom. Under outcome number 3, you would ensure that you have a little bit of marketing help, because now you need to get these out online. But in outcome number 2, you're also improving your alternative revenue streams. So now you decide that you're going to expand this, this training that you used to offer in person. Now you're going to offer it online, and it's not just for nonprofits. Now it's also for I don't know, social enterprises, for instance, right? Totally making this up. But outcomes number 2 and 3 would fit very nicely because it's one move. You're making almost one pivot as an organization, right? Or for instance, outcomes 1 and 4, you want your board members to now receive training on how to offer your services within this new hybrid method of working. Sometimes board members are going to have to come on Zoom. They don't know how. Maybe sometimes they're going to have to come into the space and you need to actually modify that space a little bit to make it a little bit bigger and a little bit safer for everybody. You could have your space slightly modified. Maybe you have to take off a door, or you have to modify a wall to just increase it a little bit, or add a window for ventilation or something. And then you could have those board members come in and receive training with a consultant. That's outcomes 1 and 4. You never want to select them all, and you really don't want to select more than 2. I don't think it's recommended.
Okay, and then another question, approximately how many hours would it take your team to write an OTF grant?
Generally about 10. I find on average we can do it in about 10. Where organizations get cost savings is when they provide us with information. The more information you can provide, the easier it is for us to write a grant. And of course, we don't charge to copy and paste anything. So let's say there was a question that said, tell us about your organization, and you have a really great answer crafted. We're not going to charge you anything for that because you've done the work there. Our process is generally to draft the application in a Google Doc in collaboration with you. We'll usually get on a call. We'll talk about the specifics of your strategy and your budget, and then we write and we write that application. Reach out to you if there's any sort of questions or gaps, and then at that point we turn it over to you for a review, and you provide us with feedback. We do 1 round of revisions, a comprehensive round. We'll rewrite the whole thing if we have to, and then it's onto the online portal. We do all the uploading for you, and we just produce a PDF. You give it the green light, and then we press submit. So the process is very nimble. It's meant to go very quick. It's meant to save you time. The goal is that hopefully you can keep doing the good work that you're doing on the front lines of your community while we work in the background as a fundraising machine. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, that's it for the questions right now.
Awesome. So I talked a little bit about ineligible expenses. I hope it's clear that there's no core or operations funding funded. It's really meant for programs and projects that are specifically an adaptation to COVID. I talked about how we offer services as well. We can put in a quote if anybody asks, a very reasonable quote. And in terms of eligibility requirements, so there's a few requirements, but the one I want to focus on is financial statements, because this gets everybody. OTF has such stringent financial statement requirements that your financials must be completed within 12 months of your most recent fiscal year end, whether that's March or December or whatever month. But they have to be comparative financials. So you have to have that particular fiscal year and the previous year side by side. They have to be by a licensed public accountant. The LPA really gets a lot of organizations because they assume that their accountant is a licensed public accountant. Sometimes they are, but when you go on the Ontario Trillium Foundation's website, you click on the financial statement policy and you click on the link. They have a link that goes to CPA Ontario. You literally have to search for your accountant there, and you have to search for them exactly as they appear on the financial statements. And if they're not there, your application gets declined right away. They're not going to talk to you. They're not going to give you a chance to look into it. They'll just decline it. And 3 months down the road, you'll find out that your application didn't even move forward past that stage. So I can't stress this enough. Make sure your accountant is an LPA, licensed public accountant. Make sure they appear on the CPA Ontario portal. And there should be no doubt about it. It should be the same name as the company. And if they don't, reach out to them. Reach out to them and find out what's going on. Maybe they forgot to pay their dues. Maybe there's a mistake on the portal, but I've heard of a lot of organizations getting stuck with this. We had to troubleshoot with some as well. In some cases, we've actually had to refer them to another accountant who was an LPA. The other one is surplus or deficit. So they have a calculator on their website, and if your organization has a little bit of a bigger budget, you might find that you do generally result in a surplus that's more than what's allowed. So in that case, you have to write why. Why do you have that surplus? What are you planning to do with it? That sort of thing. And same thing with the deficit. So if you do need that help, we're happy to help. We've done those before. The quotes I already spoke about quite a bit. And the application is done through an online portal. That's about it for most of the eligibility requirements. The financials are really the thing to watch. Very briefly, in terms of assessment, they're going to assess the organization itself. So did you meet the eligibility requirements? Do you have the right financials? That sort of thing. The project will then be assessed. So is it actually an eligible project? Are you within the confines? And then they'll go deeper into the project. Well, what is the outcome you selected? Does this match? Is this going to help you really recover or to be resilient or not, right? So this is outlined very clearly on their website. I don't want to get into all the details about what percentage, each one has weight, percentage weight. But generally, if you want a great application, make sure it's extremely clear how you're going to recover and rebuild from COVID. If I could underline one word, it's COVID, which is the whole goal here. Demonstrate how your organization will address those recovery needs. Talk about your needs and your project and how your project is a perfect response to your needs, right? And generally speaking, talk to your team, figure out if the activities that you're proposing are aligned with your plan. If you don't have a recovery plan, make sure that what the board is planning for the next year or so is very well aligned with what's in this grant application. Make sure it's feasible, right? If you're wanting to do some sort of a structural renovation and your landlord hasn't approved it, well, that's not really feasible. I should mention that you need to have a 5-year lease if you want to make any significant structural changes. Essentially a 5-year lease or ownership of the building. So they consider 5 years the equivalent of ownership. And is your budget appropriate? It's not just have we asked for the right amount of money, it's have we asked for sufficient money. Sometimes you can actually be asking for too little. And OTF reviewers, they know that, if you want to do a strategic plan and you've asked for $1,000, you're probably not going to be able to do it in that amount of money. And so make sure you ask for enough. And generally, if working with us, please give us 2 weeks to work on the grant. We do encourage everyone to apply early. And as mentioned, reapply if your application was previously declined. So please reach out to Volunteer MBC if you are interested in applying for this grant. And pleasure to speak with you all today. Happy to stick around for more questions.
Thanks so much, Rohit. Anybody else have any questions? Please feel free to go ahead and ask. So Rohit, if you have been successful before, and you mentioned, definitely go into a different area, which is, but about the amount that you're asking, what would you suggest? Because it's up to 150, and is there like a sweet point, that you should be asking for, without being, too presumptuous that, you're going to, because obviously the money isn't quite there like it was in the first few rounds, right?
This is true, and it's a good point. I'll tell you what happens at the review stage. So the project manager, which is the staff at OTF, they do a review and they assign a score. Then the jurors, and I was on the jury, we assign a score. And those scores together compile a ranking. So on the ranking report, the organizations that end up ranking higher, and I mentioned this slide with the evaluation questions. So there's certain weighting that comes in here when the evaluation is happening. 35% of the score is based on this and that. So based on that ranking, they literally draw a line, and the line is the cutoff. If your application made it above that line, you're moving forward at least to the next step, right? Because there's a series of steps in the process. If your application did not hit those scores and it's below the line, you're not moving forward. And so I don't tend to focus a lot on the money It's more about the alignment between the outcomes you've selected and the project that you've outlined. If it's the right outcome for the right project, first they're going to look for that alignment. And then if the budget is reasonable, you will probably score higher and you will probably move forward regardless of how much you asked for. There actually is no specific score for, did they ask for too much or too little? They don't look at that. They look at, did they ask for the right amount of money? Is it reasonable, right? And so if you really want me to, choose like how much money would be a good range, I would say a sweet spot is about 50,000. I'm assuming, but that's totally a shot in the dark. It really doesn't matter, to be honest with you. How much money you apply for is not going to determine necessarily whether you're approved or declined. It's more about the fit, that outcome, that project. Are they aligned? But if I could estimate what the average grant is going to be, it's probably going to be around 50. Some organizations will certainly ask for less. You only need $30,000 to do a really great strategic planning exercise, then for sure. Our quote comes in even less when it comes to fund development work. Yeah, try not to ask for too much. I find that's where organizations go wrong. They want this and this and this. We want a consultant and we want technology and we want a social enterprise and we want, you don't want to make this whole list. You really want to focus and narrow down what you need the money for, how it's going to help you to recover and to really be resilient from the impacts of COVID.
That's great. And there's another question here. As a volunteer center with backbone supports for other not-for-profits, is there any advantage angle we can leverage or a way to stand out? For example, going for the new ways for organizations to work together outcome.
Okay. So what you want to do, and you're not going to like this, but you want to be selfish in this grant. You want to focus on how your organization can meet its needs to recover, to be resilient, to keep your doors open. And in doing so, by keeping your doors open and by continuing to serve the community, you will be meeting the needs of your members and all the organizations you work with. This grant really is about being a little selfish and turning inwards and saying, well, what do we need as an organization to survive? How do we continue to work together with our community? But it really starts with you first. You will stand out as a volunteer center if you talk about ways for your own organization to recover and be resilient. There's a question specifically that asks, how many additional months for how many additional months will you be able to keep your doors open, essentially, as a result of this grant? So you can choose, 1 to 3 months, 4 to 6 months, 7 to 9, 10 or more, 12 or more. And so in that question right there, they're pretty much saying, well, tell us what this is going to do for your organization specifically. We don't care that much about your members. We care about you as the volunteer center. So yeah, focus on your own organization. If you can help yourselves and if you can recover and totally be resilient, you're going to help your members as a result.
Okay, that's great. Just wanted to say a lot of people are saying really great info. Thank you. Thank you so much. Very truly informative, excellent information, Rohit. Thank you, Volunteer NBC, for organizing this webinar. See if there's any more questions. Somebody has their hand up. Mirja, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sorry, this cuts in and out, but I just wanted to really understand better. I know this is likely the last opportunity to apply.
Oh, you're cutting in out.
What? Oh, I will try to type. Is that better? Can you hear me?
You can say it. It's okay. You can say it.
If there's already a grant in place, can you still apply for another?
Yes. If you have a grant in place, so somebody just asked me this a few days ago and I looked into it, any grant that you have is going to be going until the end of the year, unless you've been granted an extension. That being said, this grant doesn't actually come, like the money won't actually come to you until I'm saying late March, but it's probably going to be April, to be honest. You shouldn't have a conflict there. Now, you have to ask for a different outcome. So I would not recommend asking for the same outcome as something you've been funded for already. Do not do that. It should be a totally different project. You know, like before you hired a fundraising consultant, now you are organizing, you know, peer learning, outcome number 5. So you went from outcome 2 to 5. That's great. You went from outcome 2 to 2. They're going to look at it and they're going to say, well, these guys are already given a grant for outcome 2. Why should we fund them again? Right.
Excellent. Now, is there, again, so you're saying sort of that sweet spot is about 50,000. Should we align our grant sort of based on successes of the first grant? Like we're actually building and being resourceful, or it doesn't matter?
It doesn't matter, no. And
Okay.
even with the sweet spot, I'm really on the fence here because there is no sweet spot, right? Like if you're planning to apply for 10,000 and that's what you need, go for it. If you find that your organization has truly done a detailed assessment and you really need 75,000, go for it. If I look at the average, just based on how granting goes and based on the different amounts people are going to ask for, probably the average will be about 50. It might even be about 43 if I'm being specific. But no, I mean, you ask for what you need, right? And let them assess based on the strength of the application, how the outcomes align to the project objective. Is this the right funding for your organization at the right time? You know, and if so, then you know, if it's the right amount at the right time for the right organization, yeah, you're probably going to get the grant.
Okay.
Anyone else have any questions? No. I see a couple of people just joined. So we were just actually finishing the webinar, but we will certainly share the recording and everything that Rohit has shared with us today, which is quite a lot. I'm really, really grateful, Rohit, because I've learned a couple of things, and I'm just my mind is actually going into a million different directions because we originally, you know, had planned on potentially applying on behalf of the OVCN, but found out that that's not really possible. So, but I really, really appreciate this session. And if there is no other questions, we will definitely share the recording with you. And sorry, Brenda, I hope there wasn't a misunderstanding.
Mine said 10:30 to 11:30. My link that was sent said 10:30 to 11:30.
Did it really?
Yeah.
It's possible, depending on the time zone settings. Sometimes one Google or Microsoft Teams does that sort of thing. Luckily, there's a recording. So.
Yeah. No, it said 10:30 to 11:30 because I had rearranged everything for the other time. And then when I got the link, it said 10:30. So then I had to rearrange everything back.
I'm wondering if it has something to do with the time change, because it definitely everybody else got here at the right time. But we'll definitely share it with you. And sorry, there's another question from Jennifer. We operate under a shared platform backbone charity supporting multiple program areas similar to the organizational mentor role that OTF identifies. I have some specific questions, but we'll send Rohit an email. Okay, thanks so much. And Heather, thanks so much for being with us, and we'll definitely send you the recording. If there's any other questions,
maybe you could reach out to Volunteer NBC and they'll compile them all into sort of one.
Yeah, absolutely. We will gladly do that for you. Yeah. And Jane saying this has been so great. Thank you so much. And Rohit, thank you for taking the time. Really, really appreciate this. You don't have to do this, so we truly appreciate that, because I know you've shared how busy you are right now. So this is amazing. Thank you. Thank you. And thanks everyone for making the time. And we'll try to get the recording to you as soon as possible.